Hey everybody, we are back with Button Pushers. I'm Meg,
And I'm Ben.
and today we are rolling out with some digital stuff. I know a lot of people have been asking us some stuff about digital. Ben's excited. I hope you
I
guys are
am.
all excited. Digital is one topic that a lot of people struggle with, especially when I was first started teaching. I struggled with it, and that's how I actually met Ben. Is because I was listening to his channel, the Rock the Registry, because I didn't even know digital stuff. I was never taught it in school. It was like a paragraph in one chapter, and then I was just exposed to it. 15 years ago, I was thrown into this digital world, and nobody ever sat down and explained to me why or how digital works. So we are going to try to flatten the curve, right? And try to
Mhm.
expose everybody to a little bit of digital world and probably end up doing this for quite a few episodes. So
Yeah, I'm excited that we're gonna be. I think this is gonna be the topic for quite a while. And part of that is like I'll be completely honest. Like when I first started working as an X-ray tech, the facility I was at, we had just moved from film to digital, and I was still working on some film systems at some of the facilities I was at, and I got zero training on digital, and so I just brought all of my film stuff into
mhm.
digital,
Oops.
and it that was a really really bad mistake. I'm sure I over irradiated some people, and I regret that, and so that's why I've gotten so serious about understanding it, not just for teaching purposes, but I want to make this as practical as possible. So let me just kind of, in a nutshell, talk about the issue with digital. We talk about it as dose creep, and I've always thought that would be a really good like name for a punk rock band if of extra text. So the dose creeps. If anyone's
Uh-huh.
interested in creating that band, just shoot me something in the comments. But there's a blessing and a curse to digital in so many words. So the blessing is like in the days of film, if something was overexposed, you could see that, and if it
Hmm.
was overexposed, you could see it. We'd say it was burned out.
Hmm.
Um,
And then you were
it, the,
going to the repeat bin of shame. Yep.
yeah, and
Hmm.
the
Everyone
radiologist
knew.
cursing you out, and
Yep.
you're like, yeah, who's this guy? Um,
Sorry, first day.
mhm. And you had this really narrow dynamic range that you had to work in. So we'll use that term a lot, but basically the dynamic range is just that range in which you have a good picture. That's the way I'm going to
Mhm.
use that term. So the dynamic range was very narrow.
The H&D
Um,
curve.
mhm, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. It was
very
literally
small.
just it was just this little S curve, with the underexposed being at the bottom part of the toe of the curve, and the overexposed or the overkill range being kind of the shoulder of the curve. And we're still going to use those H&D curves. We'll talk about those some more in the future, um, but the blessing of digital was it could be overexposed, underexposed, optimal, and the picture always looks the same. So the problem with that is that we could be routinely overexposing our patients, and that is the term dose creep. And it's a real thing. And it largely came from the situation that I described earlier, where there were X-ray techs that transitioned film techniques into the digital world, and we didn't realize that, you know, that just because the picture looked good doesn't mean it was a good exposure. So that's why industry came up with exposure indicators. And these are hidden somewhere on the screen. So I tried to find one here. This is one I think I found on a Fuji system. They're like buried in there. Um,
Mhm.
but if you know what you're looking for, you can find them. And they're actually what you should be looking for to make a determination about whether or not you've got a good exposure. You don't look at the picture and say, yeah, that looks good. That's what I used to do in film. No, you have to look at the exposure indicator, exposure index. The problem with these bad boys is like it gets really confusing really fast because every single one of these manufacturers has different names, different proprietary names for their exposure indicators, just to make it as confusing as possible. And this has been a problem that we've been trying to address pretty much since digital got rolled out. So I've got an article here. I just typed into um, a research database and found an article from 2011 that was looking at this, and it's the problem's still here. the way that, so quick segue for next week, we're going to be talking, I think, about the deviation index. And that was the answer to this problem. But I want to talk a little bit before we jump into deviation index, I do want to spend some time talking about exposure indicators, because if we understand them, they can actually be our good friend for predicting what our technique should be. So every time students are asking me, like, what should my technique be? The old school, film tech in me is like, well, look at your dang technique chart. And then I remember, oh, we don't have technique charts anymore. And then it's like, well, why don't we have technique charts? And it's because we have exposure indicators. These can guide us in developing a technique if we understand what they're doing. And that's a big if, because you pretty much have to be a super genius to understand what these things are doing. So I'm going to talk about them. And I've kind of compiled this list. This is not exhaustive, but I've got the 3 different types of exposure indicators that are out there. And let me try to zoom in a little bit here. Good, I think that'll work. And I don't know if y'all can see my cursor here. I'm gonna also get some annotations going. So the first type that I want to talk about is the logarithmic exposure indicator. The manufacturers that adopted this were early adopters of digital imaging technology like Kodak and AGFA. So the first system I ever worked on was an AGFA system. And I was telling Meg, like, the logarithmic is the most annoying of all the types. And it's so annoying that even just talking about logarithmic stuff, the more you talk to people about the logarithm, they are exponentially more likely to not want to talk to you anymore. So that's one of the issues with this system, is it's inherently confusing. So bear with me. It gets better. It does get better, I promise. But we need to start here, because one of the problems with this is it's already referring it to as exposure, EI. This symbol that we frequently use was first adopted by Kodak, and it's confusing because that was a logarithmic system, which wasn't actually kind of purely an exposure indicator. So things that I do like about the logarithmic systems that were proposed by Carestream and AGFA was that the detector calibration conditions, so this is going to be one of the most important things for us to consider kind of throughout this, is what's going on here. And these conditions are close to ideal conditions for taking an X-ray, with the one problem that they used freaking copper for calibration, which is really obnoxious because we don't use copper routinely for filtration in the X-ray suite. So like, ideally, we would have calibration conditions that mirror what we're doing routinely for diagnostic imaging. So we wouldn't want to calibrate something and then do a totally different thing for diagnosis. CT really solved this early on, in that everything in CT is calibrated based on water. And that was really great, So ideally, we would have calibration conditions that mirror what we're doing regularly in clinical practice. So they at least were close to clinical practice in terms of the KVP that they set. So even though this was an early adopter, they already were suggesting that KVP should be higher than were routinely used for film. 2 things that they're exploiting with this is the K-edge of tungsten. And I don't want to get too much into the weeds on K-edge, but basically it's that point at which tungsten starts to produce characteristic radiation that would be diagnostically useful. It's also exploiting the K-edge of the detector material. So that's something to consider as well. Anytime we're starting to mess with KVP, we can't just be asking what's happening in terms of X-ray production, like Bremsstrahlung and characteristic effect stuff. We also need to be thinking about how the detector crystals or the detector technology is going to respond to those X-ray energies, because they have a K-edge as well. And then this WTF, this is saying, what is this? So knowing everything that I just said, about these logarithmic systems, and I'm trying to avoid talking about logarithms as much as possible. But knowing that, what does that mean for predicting technique? Well, basically, on the Kodak system, on the Carestream system, you take the base levels like 300, and so I add the EI to 300. If I see the EI basically plus 300 would be 2 times the exposure, right? So EI minus 300 would be like half the exposure, if that makes sense. So if I see, if I was shooting for this exposure, like, I don't know, just 60, right? And I've got 360, that means that I'm 2 times what I needed, right?
Oh,
So
I see what you're saying. So the
yeah,
300 is basically kind of like the target index.
yes,
Okay.
yes. And the only good thing about AGFA is even more annoying, because they've got like even more copper going on here. But they kept the 300 thing, they just expressed it slightly differently as 0.3. So basically, both these systems, if you're looking at a logarithmic system, plus 300, you need to cut the exposure in half. You know what I mean? Like, you've got your overexposed, plus 0.3 on the AGFA, you've got 2 times the exposure. So I'm just, the reason I just looked at 2 times the exposure is I'm trying to correct for overexposure. That is dose creep. And so this is, if we're seeing more, either 300 more on Kodak or 0.3 more on AGFA, we need to cut our mass in half. We need to cut our mass in half.
Okay.
All right. It gets better. It gets better. I know that was miserable. So 2 ones that are a little bit better. The proportional ones. So I'm moving on to a different type. This is proportional. It is like directly proportional. So as the number goes up, I know my exposure has gone up. As the number goes down, I know my exposure has gone down. That's really nice, right? Like, this is actually pretty useful. So both Siemens and GE, as well as a number of other proprietary folks, use the proportional counter. Other great things about these is they're using detector calibration conditions that are much closer to what we would expect in clinic. I'm a little annoyed with Siemens because they're still using the copper, but you'll notice GE, I love these guys. It's 80 kVp and standard filtration. Thank you, GE. That's super helpful. They're actually probably my favorite one. Now,
They're my favorite too. That's why they're my background right now. I'm a GE girl.
I love GE. I think it's great. And one of the reasons I love it is because, number one, it's proportional. So again, as the number goes up, I know proportionally my exposure has gone up. So if I see twice what I wanted to see, I need to cut my exposure in half. If I see half what I wanted to see, I need to double my exposure, right? And that's true for any amount, you know? So if it's a quarter more than what I wanted, I need to reduce it by a quarter, right? And so you can use a fixed KVP in this instance. Like, if I'm doing kind of an anatomic imaging, I can have a fixed KVP of 80 KVP, and I can just vary my mass based on what I want to see proportionally. That's awesome. Like, I think they just won, right? So
easy breezy,
yeah, super easy. You don't even need a deviation index here, because if you understand what this DEI is doing, you can predict techniques on anything. The only thing that you might need, and this is going to make me sound like a mega nerd, is calipers. This actually creates a basis for scientifically predicting patients' required exposures based on the density of the material that I'm X-raying. So if I have a caliper measurement, I basically know what my mass should be, you know, and it's a no-brainer at that point. I mean, I don't think I quite train like dental hygienists to figure it out, but I think X-ray techs could figure it out from that point. All right. So the last one on my list, I actually like the Fuji system. And I know, Meg, you're not a big fan of Fuji, but I want to talk to you all a little bit about what I like about Fuji. So Fuji is based on an S number, which represents speed. And so there's probably a few film techs who might be watching this, and you remember thinking about film speed. So everything is based off of film speed, and a kind of general range film speed would be 200, right? That was kind of a standard film speed. If we wanted to do, if we wanted to do detail stuff, we would use a slower film speed. We would use like a 100 film speed. And if we wanted to, for whatever reason, reduce patient dose, we could use a higher speed film. So like a 400 speed film. It's going to reduce the required radiation exposure, but you're not going to have the same amount of detail that you would want, right? So we had special image receptors and special film that we would load for like orthopedic work or for wrist x-rays, because we're trying to see little tiny fractures in the wrist bones. But at an S number of 200, so what this is telling me, first off, like, how do I apply this? Number one, there's some good stuff about this. You'll notice that the calibration conditions are close to those of clinical. So it's 80 kVp, 3 millimeters of aluminal total filtration. So that's very, very close to like clinical standards, if not right on it. And if I know that my S number should pretty much always be around 200, but it's going to vary inversely. The kind of redneck way that I remember that is, if the S number is high, you need to higher your technique. And if it's low, you need to lower your technique. And it's proportional. So if I've got, I wanted an S number of 200 and I've got 400, I need to double my technique, right? And if I have an S number of 100, and again, I wanted 200, I need to cut my technique in half. So it's still,
it so drives me crazy. Like
I know.
I really have a hard time with that one.
It's the inverse thing that trips people up.
Yeah.
But it's still proportional. So just remember that if it's low, I need to lower my technique. If it's high, I need to higher my technique, and you're good to go. Like, you can still use to predict technique. You can still use caliper measurements to figure out what mass you need to use. If you're basically, if any procedure that you would be using 80 kVp on, you can vary your mass accordingly. Mm-hmm. So I've been talking a lot about fixed kVp techniques, right? Where we just look at the detector calibration conditions and we say, okay, 80 kVp or 75, whatever was calibrated for, that's going to be my fixed kVp, and I will just vary mass accordingly. But one of the revolutions of digital imaging, and kind of the last thing I want to talk about today, is using what we know about digital to further decrease patient dose by pushing the margins with increased kVp. So like 15% rule stuff, right? So here's, this is a Fuji system. Let me stop this. Last picture I want to look at. This is from Fuji. And these are 3 images that I took on a Fuji machine. I can't remember when it was, but you'll notice the S number is close to the same. You start to see it kind of vary a little bit. All of these for this exposure are overexposed. So I should point that out. The S number is high on, or it's low on all of them. So I need to lower my mass. But look at this mass on this 3rd image real quick. Like, I'm saying I need to lower my mass. Like, I could actually shoot this and I'm looking for 200 mass on this, or 75 thereabouts. Like anywhere from 75 to 200 would be good. So I could shoot this X-ray potentially at somewhere around 0.25 to 0.5 mass, right? And I would have an ideal S number at 106.
That's blowing my mind.
106 kVp.
You have to have like a really good system to be able to do that, because I feel like my system would just have quantum model going all over it at that kind of a mass. Yeah, well, but you're right. Like some of these systems are able to do techniques like that for sure.
Well, there's a reason I picked the hand. The hand is like a really small piece of anatomy, and you don't have the weird stuff that goes on in the feet, you know, where you've got the ankle getting in the way. So it's not, this is an ideal piece of anatomy to be X-raying, you know, is the hand, because it's not very dense and stuff. So, but you'll notice in terms of contrast and stuff like that, not a lot is changing with contrast. So that was the big kind of thing in film days, was like, if you vary the KVP, the contrast is going to change a lot. We're going to talk about how contrast is worked with in digital, because there are things that influence image contrast. KVP still plays a role in subject contrast, but the computer's controlling for image contrast. And so knowing that, I can exploit this and potentially further reduce patient dose by increasing KVP while reducing mass. Because the more x-rays that fly through the patient without interaction, basically the less dose the patient's received, and I still have a picture. This patient here got completely zapped, right? Like 20 mass on a hand x-ray. What was that tech smoking? But you'll notice, so the one in the middle I picked because this literally was a technique I used to shoot all the time on film for hand. But I can't really tell any appreciable difference between these two images here. And in fact, I've definitely have a reduced dose here, and I could further reduce dose. So yeah, that's really all I've got for us today with exposure indicators. These are ways to, once you know, and it takes you maybe 5-10 minutes to look up for each machine that you're working on, how its exposure indicators working, what are those conditions under which it's been calibrated. And once you know that calibration condition, you can start to develop a fixed KVP way of looking at things. And if you have, if you don't have calipers, that's fine. Get one of those little measure, like just like how all those x-ray techs have markers. Get like one of those garment measuring tapes. I have one that I keep in my pocket in scrubs, and I'll measure. I'll measure the anatomy real quickly, just like the way a tailor measures for a suit or something like that. And then I know, okay, this piece of anatomy is this thick. I can set my mass accordingly if I know my exposure indicator. So it takes all the guesswork out of it. You don't have to. Once you know that, you know exactly what you should be doing in terms of your mass. The only thing that gets fuzzy, like I mentioned, is when we start playing with the KVP. But if we start to understand kind of what the exposure indicator is doing, we start to measure our parts and we figure out how to vary the mass, then we can kind of next level it, and we can start to push for increased reduction in patient dose by playing with the KVP some.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. The 15% rule, I think we're going to start seeing more and more, because now with digital, the KVP is affecting the image so much different that we really can do the maintain 15% rule, right? So you're bringing one up, the other one's down, bring KVP up 15%, which is approximately about 10 KVP, and half your mass, and you're actually reducing your patient dose. So literally this morning, we just did an experiment in class where we did a shoulder x-ray on a phantom, and the APR for the tube recommended, 70 at 12.5. And we took it, and it ended up being really close. We got a DI of 0, which we'll talk about next week, the deviation index stuff. But then we looked at Merrill's, and Merrill suggested doing 80 at 6, I think, or something like that. So we ended up doing the 15% rule, brought up the KVP up to 80 or 85, and then cut our mass in half to 6 or 6.3 or something like that, and ended up getting 0 again. And we saved, the DAP went down to like 220 compared to 350 on the original. So huge difference in patient dose. Your patient dose is measured on that DAP. And if you have access to watching that, like, just because you shoot a green image and it's, a DI of 0, and you hit your EI and you hit the target index and all that, we don't want you just to stare at that and be like, well, I got a 0, I'm good. If you can apply the 15% rule and cut your patient dose, that's what you should be doing. And so that's why we got the whole button pusher term, right? Because it's a lot of people are just like pressing the button, oh, I got a green, I'm good. In reality, you got to be thinking about, what else can I do? What else can I do to save patient dose? Oh, 15% rule, boom.
Yeah, and I think there's something here for management too. If you can figure out a way, and this is one thing that I know that people are researching now with DICOM, if you can figure out a way to look at your DAP or look at exposure indicators and look at mass and KVP on just a spreadsheet, and you can look consistently like across your department, this is how the techs are shooting on this machine or what have you. you can actually start to predict when you need to replace a tube. And you can
Oh,
also,
yeah.
you can predict those techs who need correction or who need additional education around this stuff. Because guess what? Like all this stuff does influence tube life as well. And tube life cuts into your revenue. So
Right.
there's anytime we can link patient radiation safety to economic stuff, to like saving the department money, that's when we're going to have the win-win. It's
All in,
like
yeah.
just telling techs that you're going to reduce patient dose will not change generally people's attitudes. But if you tell them like, hey, we can reduce dose and also reduce our costs, then you're
Mhm.
talking about, actually
Mhm.
saving money. And this is a much more realistic way to reduce patient dose than like gonadal shielding or something like that.
Yes,
So I
totally.
had to say that.
Awesome.
All
Yeah.
right. Well, next week we're back with, I think, Meg, you're going to be talking to us about deviation index,
Yeah,
right?
and kind of going over a little bit about the ART specs on how you can actually change your deviation index other than just mass and kVp. So we'll talk about that.
Great. See y'all next week.
Bye. Have a good one.
Bye.